I've got everything I need to write this. Let me build it around a first-person male narrator over 60, addressing the audience by relationship terms, like folks, friend, fixing the medical logic and location logic holes, the comments flagged, adding resolution for side characters, and keeping the calm is scarier than rage spine that drove the original's top comments. I'll write it directly in the chat as requested. No artifact. I've been asked what I said when I found her on that kitchen floor. People want to know if I shouted, if I put my fist through a wall, if I came apart right there on the tile. I didn't. What I did over the next 9 days, some folks would call it merciless. I call it exactly what she deserved from the man who promised to protect her. Let me tell you what happened, friend, because if I don't start from the beginning, none of what I did later is going to make a lick of sense to you. My name is Walter Combs. I'm 66 years old, and I have been married to Renata for 34 years. Up until 12 days ago, I would have told anybody who asked that my family was steady. Not flashy, not perfect, but steady. The kind of steady you earn by showing up every single day for 3.5 decades, by paying tuition nobody thanked you for, by loving people even on the days they made it hard. My daughter Marissa is 31, smart as a whip, sharper tongue than her mother, and married for a little over 3 years to a man named Preston Yates. Preston's family, the Yates family, his father Roland and his mother Vivian, they'd never sat right with me. First time I shook Roland's hand at the engagement dinner, he squeezed a little too hard and held it a little too long, like he was sizing up furniture he intended to buy. I smiled through it because that's what a father does when his daughter's in love. That was mistake number 1. 11 days ago, I flew out to Phoenix for 3 days of supplier meetings, something I do maybe 6 times a year for the hardware distribution company I built from a single rented warehouse 30 years back. Renata knew the trip. Marissa knew the trip. Everybody knew. What nobody knew, including my wife, was that my final meeting wrapped up a full day early. I could have stayed in that hotel, ordered a steak, watched whatever garbage was on cable, and called it a business trip well spent. Instead, I booked the first seat home, didn't call ahead, didn't text. 34 years married and I still like surprising my wife with an early homecoming. Go ahead and judge me for that, I don't mind. I landed, grabbed my one bag, and drove myself the 40 minutes home. It was just after 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. Now here's the detail I need you to hold on to, friend, because everything after this hinges on it. When I turned onto Larkspur Lane, I saw Roland's truck parked crooked in my driveway. That oversized black pickup he treats like a personality, parked right where my own car usually sits, like he owned the concrete under it. Something turned over in my gut. That same old feeling I'd had at the engagement dinner. I told myself I was being an old fool. Maybe they'd stop by for lunch. Maybe Marissa had them over. Families visit each other. That's normal, I told myself. I was reading trouble into nothing. I parked at the curb, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the front door. The house had that layered kind of loud, 2 different worlds happening under one roof at the same time. From the direction of the den, laughter, easy and comfortable. The sound of people who had nowhere else to be and not one worry between them. And from the kitchen, at the back of the house, nothing. Not peaceful nothing. Wrong nothing. I pushed the door open, and I saw her. Renata was down on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet under the sink, one leg folded awkward beneath her, and her right hand pressed hard against her temple. There was a dish towel balled up under her palm, soaked through dark red, and a thin trail of blood had run down the side of her face and dripped onto her cream-colored blouse. My stomach dropped clean through the floor. Her eyes found mine the second I stepped inside, and friend, I need you to understand something. I have watched my wife cry at greeting card commercials. I've seen her weep at strangers' weddings. I've seen her tear up because a song came on the radio that reminded her of her father. In 34 years, I have never once seen her look at me the way she looked at me on that kitchen floor. Like she'd been holding herself together with nothing but sheer will, waiting, and the second she saw my face, some part of her finally let go and said, "He's here now. I can stop fighting." I didn't panic. I want that on the record. I am not a man who panics. I dropped my bag, crossed that kitchen in about 3 steps, got down on my knees, and had 911 on the phone before I even finished checking her pulse. While the dispatcher walked me through keeping her head elevated and talking to me about what I was seeing, I could still hear them, all the way from the den, laughing. My daughter and Roland and Vivian Yates, carrying on like they were at a backyard barbecue, like Renata wasn't 15 feet away from them, bleeding onto her own kitchen floor. Sit with that for a second, friend. I had to. The dispatcher kept me talking, kept me calm, walked me through pressure on the wound, told me the ambulance was 6 minutes out. 6 minutes that stretched out longer than any 6 minutes I have ever lived through. When the paramedics came through that door, they moved like people who had seen real emergencies before and knew exactly what needed doing. The lead one, a woman with steady hands, and a name tag that read Alvarez, checked the wound, checked Renata's pupils, checked her blood pressure, and the look on her face told me plenty before she opened her mouth. Mr. Combs, she said, careful and even. This is a laceration from a fall, and her blood pressure is dangerously elevated on top of it. We need to transport her now, get her scanned and stitched properly. This kind of pressure spike doesn't come out of nowhere. Something's been building on her for a while. She said it plain, no accusation in it, just fact. And I looked toward that den, where the laughter had finally stopped. Something that had been hot and racing in my chest a minute earlier went very still. Cold, if I'm honest with you. I held Renata's hand while they got her situated on the stretcher and rolling toward the ambulance. She squeezed my fingers twice before they loaded her in. Twice. That's our signal. 34 years of that same signal. I squeezed back twice and told her I'd meet her at the hospital within the hour. Then I stood up straight, smoothed my jacket, and walked toward that den. Before I tell you what I did next, you should know something about me. I don't raise my voice. I've sat across boardroom tables with more money on the line than most people see in a lifetime, and I've never once had to shout to get what I wanted. I am not a violent man, but I am, without a single doubt, a man who handles things when they need handling. And that afternoon, something needed handling. If you've made it this far with me, do me a small favor and hit subscribe, would you? Doesn't cost you a thing, and it means something to a man telling you the truth about his family. Thank you, genuinely. I've walked into a lot of rooms over 66 years. Rooms where fortunes changed hands with a signature. Hospital rooms where I sat holding a parent's hand as a machine counted down what was left. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for walking into that den. The laughter had died the second I appeared in the doorway, like somebody had reached over and flipped a switch. The three of them were spread out across my couch and armchair, plates of half-eaten sandwiches balanced on their knees, glasses of sweet tea sweating rings onto my coffee table, like they'd just wrapped up a perfectly pleasant Wednesday lunch in my house. While my wife bled on my kitchen floor, I stood in that doorway a long moment, not saying one word. I've learned over 66 years that the most dangerous thing a furious man can do is slow himself down. Every instinct tells you to speed up, raise your voice, make them feel the size of what they've done. But slow is scarier. Slow tells a room you've already decided what happens next, and nothing they say is going to move that decision 1 inch. So I stood there, slow and quiet, and I looked at my daughter. Marissa stood up the second she saw my face, and I'll give her that much. She stood up fast, which told me some part of her already understood what was coming. Dad, she started. I held up one finger. Just one. She stopped talking. I turned to Roland first. Silver-templed, tanned year-round, the kind of man who'd never once done manual work but dressed like he oversaw men who did. He had his hands folded on my coffee table like he was chairing a meeting in his own conference room. I looked at him a long moment. Then I said, keeping my voice so level it probably rattled him worse than shouting would have, "Get out of my house." Roland blinked. Vivian set her tea down slow and careful. Marissa opened her mouth. Dad, just let me explain. I'm not talking to you yet, I said, still calm, still slow. Get out of my house, both of you, and I'm only going to say it once more. Roland shifted in his seat and did exactly what I knew he'd do, tried to be the reasonable one. He leaned forward with that practiced, measured voice men like him use when they want to sound like the only adult in a room full of children. Walter, if we could just all take a breath here. Roland, I said. He stopped. I didn't ask for a breath. I asked you to leave my house. Vivian grabbed her purse and touched Roland's arm, gave him that look. Wives give husbands. That means not now, not here. We're going. Roland stood up slow, the way men do when they want you to know they're leaving on their own terms, and not because you told them to. As they passed through my front hallway toward the door, they walked past the open kitchen doorway, and they saw the blood still drying on the tile, still smeared where the paramedics had worked. Vivian's hand shot to her mouth. Roland went completely still. I watched the color drain clean out of both their faces. Good. I needed that image burned behind their eyes for the rest of their lives. They left without another word passing between us. The front door clicked shut, and my house went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Just me and Marissa now. She was still standing by the couch, arms crossed tight over her chest, jaw set in that stubborn line she's had since she was 6 years old. She has her mother's eyes, always has, and right then those eyes couldn't decide whether to be defiant or ashamed. I walked over slow, pulled out a kitchen chair, and sat down across the table from her, folded my hands, looked at her. "Sit down, Marissa." She sat. "Talk," I said, "and I want every bit of it." She let out a long breath, dragged a hand through her hair, and started. And friend, what came out of my daughter's mouth over the next several minutes rearranged everything I thought I understood about that afternoon. Marissa told me Roland and Vivian hadn't just stopped by on a whim. They'd been planning that visit for nearly a month, waited on purpose for a week when they knew I'd be traveling, and they came with a folder of paperwork tied to a piece of property I've held for 22 years, a strip of commercial real estate downtown that I'd always told Marissa would come to her eventually. Somewhere along the way, Roland had convinced himself that eventually meant right now, and that with enough pressure applied to Marissa in her own kitchen, they could get her to sign documents that would begin shifting controlling interest of that property while I was 400 miles away in Phoenix, with no idea any of it was happening. I want you to think about that for a second, friend. Same as I had to. These people walked into my home, sat at my table, and worked to manipulate my daughter into signing away something I'd spent 2 decades building, timing it around the 1 week I wasn't there to stop it. I kept my face perfectly still while she talked. Inside was a whole different story. "And your mother," I said quietly. "Where does she fit into all this?" Marissa looked down at the table. She came into the kitchen about half an hour after they got here. She'd heard some of what Roland was pushing, and she wasn't having it, Dad. You know how she gets. 34 years, I know exactly how she gets. She told Roland straight out that the property wasn't mine to sign away, that you hadn't agreed to any of it, that they were out of line showing up like this. Marissa's voice tightened. Roland tried talking over her, and she got loud right back at him. It went back and forth for a few minutes, and then she stopped talking mid-sentence. Said her vision was going blurry and her head was pounding. She said she needed to sit down somewhere quiet, so she went into the kitchen. Marissa paused, swallowed. I was going to go check on her. I really was, Dad. But then Roland started up again about the paperwork, and I got pulled back into it, and I got pulled back in. She couldn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. I sat with everything she'd just told me for a long, heavy moment. I could still smell the faint copper smell of blood underneath the kitchen air freshener. Then I said, "So, let me make sure I understand this correctly." My voice had changed, and even Marissa noticed it, straightened up a little in her chair. "Your mother stood in her own kitchen and told your father-in-law he was out of line. He talked over her. Things escalated. She told you her head was pounding and her vision was going, and you went back to the den to keep negotiating property paperwork." Marissa said nothing. "You went back to the den," I repeated. Not a question, just the fact of it, sitting there on the table between us like something neither of us could lift. "Dad, I didn't realize it was that serious." "She's had high blood pressure for 8 years," I said. "You have known that for 8 years. A paramedic, a woman who has never met your mother one time in her life, understood the urgency of it inside of 30 seconds. And you." I stopped myself, because I felt it right then. That particular ache a man feels when he's raised somebody, sacrificed for somebody, and realizes, in one terrible instant, that somewhere along the road, something in them just didn't take. I stood up and said the last thing I planned on saying to my daughter that day. "I don't know who you've been letting yourself become, but she is not the woman I raised." I walked out of that kitchen and drove straight to the hospital, and I did not speak to Marissa again for the rest of the night. But understand something, friend. My silence wasn't weakness, and it sure wasn't me letting it go. My silence was me thinking. And when Walter Combs gets quiet, when he goes still like that, that's exactly when people ought to start worrying. Renata came through the emergency room fine, all things considered. 11 stitches along her hairline where she'd struck the edge of the counter going down. Her blood pressure brought down with medication and monitoring. Kept overnight for observation, same as the doctor wanted out of caution. I sat in a plastic chair beside her hospital bed until nearly midnight, holding her hand, watching the machines blink their steady green rhythm, thinking about 34 years. I thought about the woman who married me back when I had more ambition than money in the bank, who stood beside me, stacking inventory in that first rented warehouse until midnight some nights, who raised our daughter with more patience than I ever managed to find in myself, more grace than the girl probably deserved some days, more love than either of us likely recognized in the moment we were living it. I thought about her on that kitchen floor, and then I stopped thinking, and I started moving. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning. Not peaceful quiet. The kind with weight to it. The kind that presses down on your chest and makes every small sound. The squeak of a nurse's shoe. The hum of a vending machine down the corridor. Feel louder than it has any right to be. That's the quiet I sat in that night. In a chair in the hallway outside Renata's room while she finally slept. And I opened my laptop and I went to work. Understand, I am not an impulsive man. I don't make decisions riding on the heat of the moment, and I don't do things I'll have to undo come morning. Every single thing I did that night, I had already decided while I was sitting across that kitchen table from Marissa with my hands folded and my face dead still. By the time I opened that laptop, I wasn't angry anymore. I was decided. There is a world of difference between the two. The first call I made was to the bank at 2 in the morning, because when you've held accounts as long as I have, and you're the primary holder, there's a line on the back of your card that never sleeps. I've used it exactly twice in 30 years. This made 3. Marissa had been an authorized user on my primary credit account for 9 years, 9 years of charges I never once questioned, never audited, never asked her to justify. Groceries, gas, that spa weekend in Sedona, she called. A work retreat that I'm fairly certain involved neither work nor a single spreadsheet. Removed. The representative was quick and professional. Done inside 4 minutes. Asked if there was anything else. Not tonight, I told her. Thank you. I moved to the next item. Her auto insurance dropped from my family policy before 3 in the morning. The condo took a bit more doing. I'd co-signed the lease on Marissa and Preston's place 2 years back. A nice building downtown that required a certain credit profile and income to get approved. Mine, not theirs. I called the property management office at 7 sharp when I knew someone would answer. Man named Dwight, decent fellow. We'd spoken a handful of times over the years, always brief and pleasant. I told him I needed my name off that lease at the earliest legal opportunity, and that I'd cooperate fully with whatever paperwork that required. Dwight went quiet a second, then said, "Everything all right, Walter?" "Everything's being handled, Dwight," I told him. "Appreciate you asking." Every first of the month, quiet as clockwork, I'd been wiring money into Marissa's personal account, going on 11 years now. Started as help getting on her feet after college, turned into habit, turned into something neither of us ever discussed out loud because we'd both just come to accept it as the natural order of things. I logged in at 3:30 that morning and canceled the recurring transfer, permanently. Not paused, not reduced. Canceled outright. I sat back in my chair a moment after that one, because that transfer had represented something a good deal bigger than money. It represented a version of my daughter I'd been quietly financing, a cushion, a safety net that had maybe, possibly, let her make the kind of choices a person makes when they know somebody will always be there to catch them. Not anymore. Then came the calls I'm not going to apologize to anybody for. Over the years I'd made introductions for Marissa, opened doors in this city that don't open twice, called in favors built up over decades. There's a kind of currency that takes a lifetime to earn, and it lives entirely inside other people's trust in you. I'd spent a good deal of mine on my daughter, gladly and proudly. I spent the early hours of that morning quietly taking it back. I called men and women I've known 20, 25 years. I was honest without making a production of it, told them plainly that Marissa would no longer be operating under my name, my backing, or my endorsement, and that any courtesy extended to her on my behalf should be considered finished. Every one of them asked if I was all right. Every single one respected the call without pushing for the details. That's what 66 years of keeping your word buys you, friend. People who trust that if Walter Combs makes a call like that, Walter Combs has his reasons. By 5 that morning, the shared streaming accounts were gone. The family phone plan line was cut loose, and I had a locksmith scheduled for 7:30 at the house. I stepped out into the hospital courtyard, bought a coffee from the machine by the elevators, and watched the sky go from black to gray to that pale, early blue. That means the morning's coming, whether you're ready for it or not. I thought about Roland Yates, sitting in his house right now, probably not sleeping either, probably wondering what came next. He should wonder. Because the property he'd walked into my home to manipulate my daughter into signing over, the one he planned for nearly a month, the one he timed around my absence. I'd already left a voicemail for my attorney at 6 that morning. Told him plainly I needed the documentation on the Redfield Avenue property restructured, ironclad, airtight, filed by the end of the week, and to call me the moment his office opened. Roland Yates would never, not in this life or any other, get within 100 miles of anything I'd spent 22 years building. Marissa showed up at the house at 9 that morning. I watched her from the upstairs window, saw her walk up the front path with her shoulders squared the way she squares them before a hard conversation, watched her dig for her key, try the lock, try it again, stand there a long moment perfectly still, starting to understand. She knocked. I didn't answer. She knocked again. Nothing. She pulled out her phone to call me, and I imagine that's about when she remembered it had been dropped from the family plan and gone dead sometime overnight. She stood on that porch a good while, staring at the door like it might change its mind about her, then walked next door to the Whitfields, and I watched Carol Whitfield hand her a phone with the careful, concerned look of a woman who doesn't know what's going on but can feel that it's serious. My phone rang. Carol's number on the screen. I let it ring twice, then answered. There was a silence on the line first. Then Marissa's voice came through, and it was different. The defiance from the day before was gone clean out of it. What was left underneath sounded raw, sounded younger, sounded like the girl she used to be before the Yates family got their hands on who she was turning into. I let her sit in that silence a moment. Then I said, "You let your mother stand in that kitchen and go down on that floor bleeding, Marissa. You knew her condition. You knew exactly what stress does to her blood pressure. And when she needed you, her own daughter, you chose to walk back into that den." She didn't say anything. I could hear her breathing, uneven, on the other end. "I love you," I told her. "I will always love you. But love isn't the same thing as access. And right now, every single door I've kept propped open for you in this life is shut." Another silence, this one longer. Then quiet. "For how long, Dad?" "Until you've become the kind of woman who doesn't need her father to answer that question for her." I hung up the phone. I drove back to the hospital and sat with Renata while the morning light came through the window and across her face. Tired but steady, herself again, my wife again. She looked at me a long moment. "Is everything all right?" she asked, soft. I sat on the edge of that hospital bed and took both her hands in mine, looked at her, the way you look at someone when you've come close to losing them and you need a second just to be grateful you didn't. "Everything," I said, "is handled." She studied my face a moment longer, then nodded slow and leaned her head against my shoulder. 3 weeks on from all that, I got a call from my attorney letting me know the Redfield Avenue paperwork was fully secured, sealed up tighter than a bank vault. No way for anyone outside my own direct line to touch it. I also learned, secondhand through a mutual acquaintance, that Roland Yates had gone around trying to shop that same property scheme to a couple other family members before word got back to me, and, apparently, back to a fair number of people in this city, who no longer take his calls the way they used to. Reputation is a strange thing. It travels quiet, and it travels fast. And once a man like Roland gets known for trying to steal from a family while the father's out of town, that reputation follows him into every room he walks into after. As for Preston, I understand he and Marissa have had some hard conversations all their own since that day, about his parents, about boundaries, about what he's willing to let happen in a house that isn't even his, without saying a single word to stop it. That's between the two of them, and I intend to let it stay there. Marissa reached out again, about 6 weeks after, this time by letter, an actual handwritten letter, which surprised me some. She didn't ask for the money back. She didn't ask for the credit card back, or the lease, or any of it. She asked if she could come by on a Sunday and help her mother in the garden, the way she used to when she was a girl. No conditions attached, no expectations. I read that letter twice, Then I handed it to Renata, and my wife cried for the first time since this whole thing started. And this time it wasn't the bad kind of crying. I let Marissa come by that Sunday. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her kneel down next to her mother in the dirt, the two of them working the soil together, not saying much, just working. I didn't go back out there and hand her the keys to everything I'd taken away. Trust doesn't rebuild itself in one Sunday afternoon of gardening, and I never once promised her it would. But I watched her show up. I watched her keep showing up. Every couple weeks after that, no card, no lease, no safety net, just her own two hands, and whatever she'd learned from going without. Some folks who've heard this story tell me I was too hard on my own daughter. Maybe I was. But I watched a stranger in a paramedic's uniform treat my wife's emergency with more urgency inside of 60 seconds than the woman I raised managed inside of 40 minutes. And I decided that night, the greatest act of love I had left to give Marissa wasn't keeping every door open for her forever. It was finally letting her feel, for the first time in her adult life, exactly what it costs when those doors close. She's spending these days learning that lesson the hard way, same as I once had to learn my own hard lessons at her age. She'll either grow into the woman her mother raised her to be, or she won't. But Renata is alive, she is well, and she is home. That, friend, is the only piece of this whole story that ever really mattered to me. If this story meant something to you, do an old man a kindness and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and pass this along to somebody who'd understand exactly why I did what I did. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you next time.